There's a cemetery in Orange, New Jersey, where the dead don't rest quietly. Rosedale Cemetery, a modest burial ground in Essex County, holds the remains of young women who died nearly a century ago. And if you believe the stories, if you trust the science, their bones still carry a faint luminescence, a soft greenish glow that persists in the dark, decade after decade, because radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. The women buried here were teenagers when they started. Factory workers, immigrants' daughters. They painted tiny numbers on watch dials for the United States Radium Corporation, and they were told the work was glamorous, prestigious, safe. They were told the radium would put a glow in their cheeks. It did more than that. It settled into their bones. It honeycombed their jaws. It killed them slowly, painfully, one by one, while the company that employed them knew exactly what was happening and said nothing. Today, the factory where they worked is gone, demolished in 1998 after the Environmental Protection Agency declared it a Superfund site. The 2-acre plot at the corner of High and Alden Streets is now a fenced-in field, a barren patch in a neighborhood that once existed because the factory existed. The boiler house is gone. The crystallization laboratory is gone. The painting studio where 300 young women once sat at long tables, dipping brushes into radium paint and touching them to their lips, is nothing but absence now. But the women who worked there, the ones they called the Ghost Girls, they left something behind, a legal precedent, a standard for occupational safety, the foundational data for radiation protection protocols that would later shield thousands of workers on the Manhattan Project. They also left their bones, glowing faintly in the dark earth of northern New Jersey. This is the story of how they got there. To understand what happened in Orange, you have to understand the man who made it possible. And to understand him, you have to understand the moment he was living in. In the early years of the 20th century, radium was magic. Marie Curie had discovered it in 1898, and within a decade the element had captured the imagination of the Western world. Here was a substance that glowed without flame, that emitted energy without burning, that seemed to defy the laws of physics as they were then understood. Scientists called it miraculous. Doctors called it curative. Entrepreneurs called it opportunity. Sabin Arnold von Sochoki was all three. Born in 1883 in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, von Sochoki arrived in America in 1906 with medical training from Vienna and a fascination with radioactivity that bordered on obsession. He'd reportedly studied techniques related to the Curie's work in Paris. He understood, perhaps better than most, the extraordinary properties of radium, its ability to kill cancer cells, its ceaseless emission of energy, its strange and beautiful glow. By 1913, he'd opened a laboratory in New York City to experiment with extracting radium from carnotite ore, a uranium-vanadium mineral mined in the dry valleys of Colorado and Utah. The process was painstaking. It took tons of ore to produce a single gram of radium. But von Sochoki wasn't after large quantities. He was after something more practical, a luminous paint. Working with a New York physician named George Willis, von Sochoki developed a formula that would change everything. Radium-226 mixed with zinc sulfide, bound together with gum arabic adhesive. When alpha particles from the radium struck the zinc sulfide crystals, they excited electrons that released visible photons upon returning to their ground state. The result was a paint that glowed continuously in darkness, no external light source required, no battery, no flame. They called it undark. The paint was remarkable. Apply it to a watch dial and you could read the time at midnight. Apply it to an instrument panel and a pilot could navigate without revealing his position to the enemy. Apply it to a compass, and a soldier could find his way through the darkest trench. In peacetime, this was a novelty. In war, it was essential. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. 4 days later, a young woman named Grace Fryer reported for her first day of work at the United States Radium Corporation's new factory in Orange, New Jersey. She was 18 years old. She had 2 brothers who were soldiers. She wanted to do all she could to help the war effort. The factory had been constructed that same year, a cluster of relatively Spartan industrial buildings on a 2-acre site at 422 Alden Street. The paint application building sat at the corner of High and Alden, with large windows and skylights to provide natural light for detailed work. Set back 80 feet from the street stood the Radium Crystallization Laboratory, where chemists in lead-lined aprons processed approximately 1,000 pounds of carnotite ore every day, using wet chemical methods adapted from Marie Curie's fractional crystallization techniques. The location made sense. Orange was an industrial area in Essex County, close to New York City headquarters, with established infrastructure from nearby hat factories and a ready workforce of working-class families. Late 19th century worker housing lined the streets. Commercial buildings clustered along the main avenues. The neighborhood was home to Poles, Italians, Irish, immigrants, and their children, people who understood the value of a steady paycheck. The company's product was in desperate demand. American soldiers in the trenches of France needed to read their watches and instruments at night without revealing their positions to German snipers. Radium illuminated dials provided constant visibility in total darkness. By the war's end, the United States Radium Corporation would produce luminous dials for over 4 million military watches, along with aircraft instruments, gun sights, gauges, and compasses. 95% of all radium produced in America in 1918 was devoted to this single purpose, helping soldiers survive the darkness of the Western Front. And the people who made it possible weren't scientists or engineers. They were teenage girls from Newark. The company recruited them deliberately. Young women with nimble fingers and small hands, suited for the delicate work of painting numbers no larger than a millimeter across. Working-class girls who needed the money, immigrants' daughters who saw factory work as a step up from domestic service or retail. The advertisements made it sound almost magical. This wasn't ordinary labor. This was elite employment, handling expensive, valuable materials. The radium in the paint was worth more than gold. The work was clean, respectable, even glamorous, and the pay was extraordinary. A dial painter working on piece rate could earn $20 a week, roughly $370 in today's money, which placed the top performers in the upper 5% of female wage earners in America. A skilled painter who finished 250 dials in a shift earned $3.75. The fastest could complete 300 dials a day. For young women who might otherwise work as seamstresses or laundresses, this was transformative money. Money for nice clothes, money to send home to immigrant parents, money for a future. Catherine Schaub was 14 years old when she started on February 1st, 1917, one of the youngest. Grace Fryer was 18. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. They came from Newark and Orange and the surrounding towns, and once they arrived, they recruited their friends, their sisters, their cousins. The Maggia family sent 4 daughters to paint dials: Albina, Molly, Kshinta, and Irma. They weren't unusual. The factory floor was filled with sisters and cousins and neighbors, young women who trusted each other enough to share what they thought was a good thing. Nobody told them what they were sharing. Picture the room. Long wooden tables arranged in rows, each seat occupied by a young woman in a cotton dress. Natural light streams through tall windows and skylights. The work requires precision, and the company's product was in desperate demand. American soldiers in the trenches of France needed to read their watches and instruments at night without revealing their positions to German snipers. Radium illuminated dials provided constant visibility in total darkness. By the war's end, the United States Radium Corporation would produce luminous dials for over 4 million military watches, along with aircraft instruments, gun sights, gauges, and compasses. 95% of all radium produced in America in 1918 was devoted to this single purpose, helping soldiers survive the darkness of the Western Front. And the people who made it possible weren't scientists or engineers. They were teenage girls from Newark. The company recruited them deliberately. Young women with nimble fingers and small hands, suited for the delicate work of painting numbers no larger than a millimeter across. Working-class girls who needed the money, immigrants' daughters who saw factory work as a step up from domestic service or retail. The advertisements made it sound almost magical. This wasn't ordinary labor. This was elite employment, handling expensive, valuable materials. The radium in the paint was worth more than gold. The work was clean, respectable, even glamorous, and the pay was extraordinary. A dial painter working on piece rate could earn $20 a week, roughly $370 in today's money, which placed the top performers in the upper 5% of female wage earners in America. A skilled painter who finished 250 dials in a shift earned $3.75. The fastest could complete 300 dials a day. For young women who might otherwise work as seamstresses or laundresses, this was transformative money. Money for nice clothes, money to send home to immigrant parents, money for a future. Catherine Schaub was 14 years old when she started on February 1st, 1917, one of the youngest. Grace Fryer was 18. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. They came from Newark and Orange and the surrounding towns, and once they arrived, they recruited their friends, their sisters, their cousins. The Maggia family sent 4 daughters to paint dials: Albina, Molly, Kshinta, and Irma. They weren't unusual. The factory floor was filled with sisters and cousins and neighbors, young women who trusted each other enough to share what they thought was a good thing. Nobody told them what they were sharing. Picture the room. Long wooden tables arranged in rows, each seat occupied by a young woman in a cotton dress. Natural light streams through tall windows and skylights. The work requires precision, and the company's product was in desperate demand. American soldiers in the trenches of France needed to read their watches and instruments at night without revealing their positions to German snipers. Radium illuminated dials provided constant visibility in total darkness. By the war's end, the United States Radium Corporation would produce luminous dials for over 4 million military watches, along with aircraft instruments, gun sights, gauges, and compasses. 95% of all radium produced in America in 1918 was devoted to this single purpose, helping soldiers survive the darkness of the Western Front. And the people who made it possible weren't scientists or engineers. They were teenage girls from Newark. The company recruited them deliberately. Young women with nimble fingers and small hands, suited for the delicate work of painting numbers no larger than a millimeter across. Working-class girls who needed the money, immigrants' daughters who saw factory work as a step up from domestic service or retail. The advertisements made it sound almost magical. This wasn't ordinary labor. This was elite employment, handling expensive, valuable materials. The radium in the paint was worth more than gold. The work was clean, respectable, even glamorous, and the pay was extraordinary. A dial painter working on piece rate could earn $20 a week, roughly $370 in today's money, which placed the top performers in the upper 5% of female wage earners in America. A skilled painter who finished 250 dials in a shift earned $3.75. The fastest could complete 300 dials a day. For young women who might otherwise work as seamstresses or laundresses, this was transformative money. Money for nice clothes, money to send home to immigrant parents, money for a future. Catherine Schaub was 14 years old when she started on February 1st, 1917, one of the youngest. Grace Fryer was 18. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. They came from Newark and Orange and the surrounding towns, and once they arrived, they recruited their friends, their sisters, their cousins. The Maggia family sent 4 daughters to paint dials: Albina, Molly, Kshinta, and Irma. They weren't unusual. The factory floor was filled with sisters and cousins and neighbors, young women who trusted each other enough to share what they thought was a good thing. Nobody told them what they were sharing. Picture the room. Long wooden tables arranged in rows, each seat occupied by a young woman in a cotton dress. Natural light streams through tall windows and skylights. The work requires precision, and Grace Fryer had 2 brothers fighting overseas. When she started in April 1917, just days after America entered the war, she believed she was contributing to their survival. Every dial she painted might end up on the wrist of a soldier in the trenches, helping him read the time without lighting a match that could draw sniper fire. Every instrument panel might guide a pilot through the darkness. Every compass might bring a lost infantryman home. Newspaper advertisements reinforced this framing. Xmas gifts for men over there and those who are going, one 1917 promotion declared. The message was clear. Buying a Radium watch wasn't just a purchase, it was patriotism. And painting those watches was patriotic labor, war work as essential as riveting ships or sewing uniforms. The young women internalized this narrative. They weren't just earning paychecks, they were serving their country. They were helping brothers and fathers and sweethearts survive the war to end all wars. The sacrifice of their time and labor felt meaningful in a way that ordinary factory work never could. This is what makes the story so bitter. These women believed they were giving something to their country. They thought they were part of something larger than themselves. And in a sense, they were. Their labor genuinely supported the war effort. Their painted dials genuinely saved lives in the darkness of the Western Front. But they were also being poisoned. And the company that employed them, that wrapped its recruitment in the language of patriotism and service, knew far more about the dangers than it ever revealed. The science of radium's dangers was not a mystery in 1917. It wasn't even particularly new. Pierre Curie himself had publicly stated that he would not care to trust himself in a room with a kilo of pure radium, as it would burn all the skin off his body, destroy his eyesight, and probably kill him. That warning dated back to the early 1900s. By the time the Orange factory opened, medical literature documented injuries from radium exposure, and the United States Radium Corporation possessed files of reprints of radium studies suggesting dangers dating back to 1906. Von Sachaki understood. He had studied radioactivity at its source. He knew the Curie's precautions. He knew that radium could burn, could sicken, could kill. And he had personal experience. Sometime between 1920 and 1921, radium infiltrated his left index finger so severely that he amputated it himself. The man who invented the paint cut off his own finger because of what it did to him. And still, the women kept licking brushes. Look at how the factory was organized. 2 buildings constructed just 3 feet apart. In the radium crystallization laboratory, Male chemists processed the ore and extracted the radium. They worked behind lead screens. They used tongs and ivory-tipped forceps. They wore lead-lined aprons and masks. They took extreme precautions with every contact because they understood what they were handling. 80 feet away in the paint application building, 300 young women sat at open tables in an atmosphere saturated with radium dust. They received no protective equipment, no lead aprons, no forceps, no masks, no warnings. They were actively taught to put the paint in their mouths. When asked about this double standard, company officials had an answer ready. The amount of radium in the paint was so small that protective measures weren't deemed necessary. The chemists worked with concentrated material. The painters worked with diluted paint. Different risks required different precautions. But this explanation ignored something crucial. The chemists' exposure was external. They could wash the radium off their skin, take off their aprons, go home clean. The dial painters' exposure was internal. Every time they licked a brush, they swallowed radium. Every time they breathed the dusty air, they inhaled it. The poison didn't stay on their surfaces. It went into their bones. The company knew that internal exposure was different from external exposure. They knew that radium concentrated in bone tissue. They had the scientific literature that explained these mechanisms, and they knew that their workers were ingesting the material day after day, month after month, year after year. They knew, and they said nothing. By the early 1920s, the United States Radium Corporation had become an industrial powerhouse. The war was over, but demand hadn't faded. Consumers wanted radium watches too, dials that glowed in bedroom darkness, instruments for cars and boats and airplanes, novelties that captured the public's fascination with this magical substance. The Orange Factory hummed with 3 shifts of workers. The painting studio employed as many as 300 women at a time. The crystallization laboratory processed ore around the clock. The company expanded its reach, distributing radium-based products to the medical community and marketing industrial applications. Von Soshaki's vision of a radium-illuminated future seemed within reach. In 1921, he prophesied, "The time will doubtless come when you will have in your own house a room lighted entirely by radium." That same year, von Sochoki was ousted from the company in a corporate takeover. Arthur Roeder became president, and the firm was renamed the United States Radium Corporation. The founder, who understood the dangers better than anyone, was gone. The men who replaced him understood the business better than the science. The factory reached its peak. Production soared. Profits climbed. The women who worked the painting studio earned wages that transformed their lives. Some had been painting dials for 4 years, 5 years. Their fingers stained with radium, their bodies suffused with its glow. They were proud of what they did, proud of the skill required to paint those impossibly small numerals, proud of the money they earned, proud to be radium girls. And somewhere beneath their feet, in the cellular architecture of their bones, the radium they had swallowed was beginning to speak. It started with toothaches. Molly Maggia was 24 years old in September 1921 when she first noticed the pain. An independent-minded young woman, the 4th of 7 sisters in an Italian immigrant family, she boarded in an all-female house on Highland Avenue and had worked as a dial painter for several years. She was skilled, fast, reliable, exactly the kind of worker the piece rate system rewarded. The toothache seemed ordinary at first. She went to see a dentist, Dr. Joseph Neff, expecting a routine extraction. But when he pulled the tooth, the wound wouldn't heal. Instead of closing, it became infectious, ulcerous, oozing pus. Another tooth loosened. Then another. Her gums became raw and swollen, painful abscesses forming where healthy tissue should have been. Her breath grew foul so bad that she became self-conscious at work, withdrawing from the social atmosphere she had once enjoyed. She developed aching pains in her limbs, pains so severe that she eventually couldn't walk. A doctor diagnosed rheumatism and gave her aspirin. By spring of 1922, Molly had lost most of her teeth. Her lower jaw, the roof of her mouth, and the bones around her ears had become, in the words of one doctor, one large abscess. Something was destroying her from the inside out. Dr. Neff examined her again that May. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his career. When he probed her jawbone gently with his fingers, the bone broke, not cracked. Broke. Crumbled against his touch like chalk. He didn't need surgical instruments to remove it. He simply put his fingers in her mouth and lifted the jawbone out. A few days later, her entire lower jaw came out the same way. Molly Maggia was dying, and no one understood why. Her body was attacking itself, her bones dissolving, her tissue rotting. She couldn't eat properly. She could barely speak. The disease, whatever it was, spread to her throat, eating through soft tissue and blood vessels alike. On September the 12th, 1922, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the infection finally broke through to her jugular vein. Her mouth flooded with blood. The nurse attending her, Edith Mead, tried desperately to staunch the hemorrhage. She couldn't. Molly bled to death in her bed, 24 years old, surrounded by a family that had no idea what had killed her. Her death certificate listed the cause as syphilis. Syphilis was a convenient explanation. It was a disease that destroyed tissue, that caused lesions and sores, that could explain the horrifying decomposition of a young woman's jaw. It was also shameful. A sexually transmitted infection that carried deep social stigma in 1920s America. A woman who died of syphilis was not an innocent victim. She was fallen, ruined, responsible for her own fate. For the United States Radium Corporation, this diagnosis was perfect. It deflected blame from occupational causes. It destroyed Molly's reputation, making her an unreliable witness to her own death. And it established a template. When dial painters died, find a cause that had nothing to do with the factory. The syphilis diagnosis was almost certainly wrong. Molly had taken a test that came back negative. A second test showed what may have been a false positive. But the company latched onto that second result and made it official. A young woman who had devoted years to painting radium dials, who had swallowed the poison hundreds of times a day, who had shown every symptom of radiation damage, she died of a shameful disease, and her employer bore no responsibility. This became the pattern. When dial painters grew sick, company doctors attributed their symptoms to other causes: rheumatism, phosphorus poisoning, pre-existing conditions. When dial painters died, the company contacted their physicians and, according to later testimony, threatened legal action if findings were released. Doctors, dentists, and researchers were pressured to comply with requests not to publish data connecting the deaths to radium. The corporation had invested heavily in the fiction of safety. They had told workers the paint was harmless. They had trained them to lip-point brushes. They had built an empire on the labor of young women who trusted them. Admitting the truth now would mean admitting years of negligence. It would mean lawsuits. It would mean ruin. So they chose the lie instead, and the women kept dying. Molly Maggia was the first of the orange dial painters to die. She would not be the last. Her sister Quinta, who had followed her to the factory, began experiencing the same symptoms within months: dental pain, loose teeth, aching joints. So did Albina, another sister who had worked the painting studio, and Irma, the youngest. 4 Maggia sisters had taken jobs at the United States Radium Corporation. lured by the promise of good pay and glamorous work. Now one was dead, and the others were beginning to understand that they might follow. Across Orange and Newark, other dial painters were falling ill. Women in their early 20s developing the symptoms of old age: brittle bones, chronic pain, fatigue so profound they could barely function. Dentists were seeing a pattern: young women with inexplicable jaw decay, wounds that wouldn't heal, tissue that seemed to dissolve. But no one had connected the dots. No one had named the cause. That changed in July 1923, when Catherine Schaub's cousin Irene Rudolph died. Irene had been a dial painter too. She was 21 years old. And when she died, Catherine, who had started painting dials at 14 and was now showing symptoms herself, decided she'd had enough of silence. Days after Irene's funeral, Catherine filed a formal complaint with the New Jersey Department of Labor, reporting that dial painters at her former employer were becoming mysteriously ill. It was the first official record of someone connecting the deaths to the work. Catherine was 21 years old when she filed that complaint. She had already noticed the stiffness in her legs, the exhaustion that wouldn't lift. A doctor had asked if she worked with phosphorus after noticing changes in her blood. She didn't understand what was happening to her body, but she understood that it had something to do with the factory where she'd spent her teenage years licking brushes and swallowing paint. She wasn't going to let them bury this story the way they'd buried Molly Maggia. And so we arrive at the paradox of this story. For the women who worked there, the years at the Radium factory were, in many ways, the best years of their lives. Good wages, good company, work that felt meaningful, the pride of handling valuable materials, of contributing to the war effort, of earning their own money in an era when few opportunities existed for working-class women. They were young. They were alive. They danced in dresses that glowed in the dark and laughed about the magical paint that made them shine. They recruited their sisters and friends to share in the good fortune. They formed bonds that would outlast the factory itself. But the whole time, every shift, every dial, every lick of the brush, they were being poisoned. The company that employed them knew it. The scientists who developed the paint knew it. The executives who ran the business understood the risks well enough to protect themselves while letting 300 young women swallow radium day after day. This was the golden age of American radium production, the peak of an industry built on innovation and patriotism and the labor of teenage girls. The United States Radium Corporation was at the height of its power, its products in demand, its profits climbing. And in the bones of its workers, in the jawbones of young women who trusted what they'd been told, something terrible was taking root, something that would eventually bring the whole edifice crashing down. But not yet. Not for years. Not until more women died, more families were destroyed, more lies were told to protect the profits of men who never set foot on the painting studio floor. The ghost girls were still glowing. They just didn't know yet that the glow came from inside. By 1924, even the United States Radium Corporation could no longer ignore what was happening to its workers. 50 women were ill. 12 were dead. The symptoms followed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Dental problems progressing to jaw decay, anemia, bone deterioration, death. Company President Arthur Roeder needed answers, or at least he needed something that looked like answers. So he hired experts. First came the Life Extension Institute, which examined workers and found nothing conclusive. Then Roeder turned to Harvard's School of Public Health, engaging Dr. Cecil Drinker and his wife, Catherine, both respected industrial hygienists, to conduct a thorough investigation of working conditions at the Orange factory. The drinkers arrived in June 1924. What they found was damning. The factory was saturated with radioactive contamination. Radium dust coated every surface, walls, floors, equipment, workers. The painting studio's atmosphere was thick with luminous particles. When the investigators examined the dial painters themselves, they found that hair, faces, hands, arms, necks, dresses, underclothes, even corsets were luminous. The women carried the factory home with them every night, embedded in their skin and clothes. More troubling still were the blood tests. The drinkers found unusual blood conditions in virtually everyone they examined. The workers had ingested harmful and potentially fatal amounts of radioactive material. The factory was killing them. The drinkers submitted their report to Arthur Roeder with clear recommendations. Implement safety precautions. Eliminate lip pointing. Protect the workers from further exposure. Roeder refused. He wouldn't implement the recommendations. He wouldn't change the work practices. And when the drinkers prepared to publish their findings, he threatened to sue them if they released the report. Then he did something worse. He forged his own version. The falsified report, submitted to the New Jersey Department of Labor, claimed that dial painters were in excellent health, that every girl was in perfect condition. The document bearing the drinkers' names said the opposite of what the drinkers had found. It was a complete fabrication, designed to shield the company from accountability while workers continued to sicken and die. The deception might have held. The drinkers, initially intimidated by the lawsuit threat, stayed silent. The Department of Labor accepted the falsified report. The factory continued operating, but someone at Harvard knew what had really happened. Dr. Alice Hamilton, a colleague of the drinkers and a board member of the National Consumers League, discovered the fraud. In April 1925, she wrote to Catherine Drinker, "Mr. Roeder is not giving you and Dr. Drinker a very square deal. Do you suppose Roeder could do such a thing as to issue a forged report in your name? He could. He had. And now the drinkers faced a choice: remain silent and complicit, or publish the truth and face the consequences. In August 1925, they published. By the time the real Drinker report saw daylight, the women who had worked at the orange factory were running out of time. Grace Fryer had left the company in January 1920 for a better-paying job as a bank teller. She was 20 years old, healthy, optimistic about her future. But within 2 years, her teeth began falling out. Her jaw swelled with abscesses. X-rays revealed serious bone decay spreading through her mouth and into her spine. The doctors couldn't explain it. Rheumatism, they suggested. Infection. Bad luck. It wasn't until July 1925 that a physician finally suggested what Grace had begun to suspect. Her illness might be connected to her former employment. Catherine Schaub, who had started painting dials at 14 and risen to become an instructress, teaching other girls the lip-dip paint technique, was deteriorating rapidly. The stiffness in her legs had worsened. Her stomach couldn't keep food down. In the winter of 1924, she underwent surgery. When doctors examined her bones, they found them plated with radium. The element had become part of her skeleton, inseparable from her own tissue. Quinta Maggia, who had watched her sister Molly die in 1922, was now experiencing the same horrifying progression. Her teeth dropped out. Her hips deteriorated until she could barely walk. By October 1927, she had fractured both hips simply from the weakness of her bones. She spent sleepless nights wondering if her children, Helen and Robert, had somehow been poisoned too. Albina Maggia Larice, the oldest of the dial painting sisters, was bedridden by 1927. She was 32 years old but felt ancient. 2 of her children had been born dead. stillbirths that doctors would later attribute to radium poisoning. She couldn't walk at all. Of all the women who would eventually sue the company, she was considered the worst stricken. Edna Hussman, who had continued dial painting at a second firm called Luminite, even as the dangers became clear, hobbled through her household duties in constant pain. Once a beautiful blonde, she had aged decades in just a few years. Newspapers would later describe her as doomed. These women knew each other. They had worked side by side, recruited each other to the factory, shared the pride of being Radium girls. Now they shared something else, the slow, excruciating knowledge that they were dying, and that the company responsible refused to acknowledge any connection. The disease had a name now. Dr. Theodore Bloom had described it in 1924. Radium jaw, officially known as radium necrosis of the mandible, a condition unlike anything most physicians had ever seen. What happened to the jawbones of dial painters wasn't ordinary decay. It was annihilation. Radium, once swallowed, circulates through the bloodstream until it finds bone. There it deposits, substituting for calcium in the bone's mineral matrix. And there it stays, decaying, emitting alpha particles with every transformation. These particles are highly energetic but travel only a fraction of a millimeter, just far enough to destroy the cells immediately surrounding them. In the jawbone, which received concentrated exposure every time a worker licked her brush, the damage was catastrophic. Alpha particles perforated bone cells, stripped calcium, shredded the collagen that gives bone its flexibility. The tissue became porous, ashy, gray. Blood vessels within the bone were destroyed, cutting off oxygen and preventing any possibility of healing. A healthy bone, when injured, rebuilds itself. A radium-saturated bone cannot. Every wound becomes permanent. Every extraction site becomes an open sore. Every infection spreads unchecked through tissue that has lost the ability to fight back. Dr. Kneff, the dentist who had treated Molly Magia, eventually understood what he was seeing. He removed a fragment of her jawbone and wrapped it in unexposed dental X-ray film. When he developed the film, it was fogged. The bone itself was emitting enough radiation to expose photographic paper. He was holding radioactive tissue that had come from a living woman's face. The progression was always the same. First, toothaches, then loose teeth and extractions that wouldn't heal. Then, abscesses spreading through the jaw, the cheekbones, the skull. The bone didn't just decay, it honeycombed, drilling holes through living women while they walked and talked and tried to understand what was happening to them. Some women had pieces of their jaws simply fall out. Others watched their facial features curiously alter as the underlying bone structure collapsed. Some developed massive tumors, sarcomas that grew on their legs, their shoulders, their spines. The radium didn't stay in the jaw. It went everywhere bones existed, and all the while, their skeletons glowed faintly in the dark. The luminescence that had once made them feel magical, now revealing itself as the signature of their own destruction. Grace Fryer decided to sue the United States Radium Corporation in 1925. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer willing to take the case. The obstacles were formidable. New Jersey's statute of limitations for workplace injuries was only 2 years, and Grace had left the company in 1920, 5 years before any doctor connected her illness to her employment. The law seemed designed to protect employers from exactly this kind of delayed-onset occupational disease. Beyond the legal technicalities, there was the matter of power. The United States Radium Corporation was a major defense contractor with deep pockets, influential connections, and expensive attorneys. The women seeking justice were working class, sick, growing sicker by the month. They had no money for prolonged litigation. They had no guarantee of surviving long enough to see a verdict. Attorney after attorney turned Grace down. Some didn't believe her claims. Some believed them but feared the corporation's legal resources. Some simply didn't want the trouble. Countless lawyers refused before one finally said yes. His name was Raymond Berry. He was young, a recent graduate of Yale Law School, and willing to take the case on contingency, meaning he would receive payment only if the women won. In May 1927, he filed suit on behalf of 5 plaintiffs: Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Quinta Magia McDonald, Albina Magia Larice, and Edna Hoosman. They sought $250,000 each, a total of $1.25 million, roughly $3 million each in today's money. The newspapers called it the case of the 5 women doomed to die. The description was accurate. By the time the lawsuit was filed, all 5 plaintiffs understood they would not recover. They were fighting for compensation, yes, but also for something larger: acknowledgement, accountability, the hope that their suffering might protect future workers from the same fate. Grace Fryer said it plainly: "It is not for myself I care. I'm thinking more of the hundreds of girls to whom this may serve as an example." The United States Radium Corporation's strategy was simple: delay. Every postponement, every continuance, every procedural objection served the same purpose. The plaintiffs were dying. If the company could drag out the proceedings long enough, the women might not live to see a verdict. Dead plaintiffs couldn't testify. Dead plaintiffs couldn't generate sympathetic headlines. Dead plaintiffs might let the whole uncomfortable matter fade away. The corporation deployed every tool available. They hired Frederick Flynn, presented to the public as a Columbia University specialist, to examine Grace Fryer. Flynn declared her in perfect health. A colleague present at the examination emphatically agreed with his assessment. Neither man mentioned that Flynn was not a licensed physician. He was an industrial toxicologist under contract with the company. The colleague was a vice president of United States Radium Corporation. The examination was theater, designed to generate headlines that might undermine the plaintiff's credibility. When the case reached court, company lawyers requested delays for the summer because their witnesses would be vacationing in Europe. They attacked Raymond Berry's character, threatening charges before the Bar Association. They held press conferences claiming the women could survive, that tests showed no radioactivity, that the whole lawsuit was based on hysteria and misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the evidence mounted. In October 1927, Berry arranged for the exhumation of Molly Maggia's body from Rosedale Cemetery. She had been dead for 5 years. Her death certificate still listed syphilis as the cause. When workers opened the coffin on that dim October day, they found something extraordinary. Despite the overcast sky, the inside of the coffin seemed to glow. The soft luminescence of radium compounds emanated from Molly's remains, unmistakable, undeniable evidence that her body had been saturated with radioactive material. The examining physicians found her corpse in a good state of preservation. They found 48 micrograms of radium in her bones, 500 times what would later be established as the maximum permissible body burden. They found X-ray film showing her skeleton in stark white against black, her skull with its missing jawbone making her mouth stretch unnaturally wide, as though she was screaming for justice. And they found no evidence of syphilis. None. The diagnosis that had destroyed her reputation and shielded her employer was a lie. Molly Maggia's name was cleared, but she had been dead for 5 years, and her sisters were dying too. The first hearing came on January 11th, 1928. The 5 plaintiffs arrived at the courthouse unable to raise their arms to take the oath. Grace Fryer had lost all her teeth. Her spine had collapsed so severely that she wore a steel back brace from neck to hips just to sit upright in a chair. Her left elbow couldn't move. She was 28 years old. Catherine Schaub's features had been curiously altered by the disintegration of her facial bones. She suffered constant pain in her skull. She had developed pains that made every movement agony. The two Maggia sisters, Quinta and Albina, were completely bedridden. They had to be transported to the courthouse like invalids, which they were. Edna Hussman wept as she testified, "I cannot even keep my little home, our bungalow. I know I will not live much longer, for now I cannot sleep at night for the pains." Spectators in the courtroom wept with her. The contrast between what these women had been, young, healthy, proud workers earning good wages, and what they had become, was devastating to witness. The press coverage was extensive and sympathetic. The company's strategy of delay was working legally, but it was failing catastrophically in the court of public opinion. Grace Fryer's testimony was quiet and direct. She explained how the instructors had taught her to point the brushes with her lips, how she'd lip-pointed about 6 times per dial, how the paint hadn't tasted funny, hadn't tasted like anything at all, how she hadn't known it was harmful. "Our instructors told us to point the brushes with our lips," she said. "I think I pointed mine with my lips about 6 times to every watch dial. It didn't taste funny. It didn't have any taste, and I didn't know it was harmful." The hearing adjourned with nothing resolved. The company requested another delay. The women went home to continue dying. By spring of 1928, public pressure was mounting. The most influential journalist in America had taken up the cause. Walter Lippmann, editor of the New York World, published an editorial on May 10, 1928, that crystallized the moral outrage the case had generated. "This is a damnable travesty of justice. The women are dying. If ever a case called for prompt adjudication, it is the case of 5 crippled women who are fighting for a few miserable dollars to ease their last days on earth. This is a heartless proceeding. It is unmanly, unjust, and cruel." The words landed with force. A damnable travesty, heartless, unmanly, unjust, cruel. Lippmann had given voice to what millions of Americans were feeling as they read about young women too weak to raise their hands for an oath, fighting a corporation that seemed determined to let them die before facing judgment. Other advocates rallied to the cause. Florence Kelley, national president of the Consumers League, called the case cold-blooded murder in industry. Dr. Alice Hamilton, who had helped expose the falsified drinker report, coordinated publicity and connected the women with sympathetic journalists. Catherine Wiley of the New Jersey Consumers League organized support and kept pressure on state officials. Even Marie Curie, contacted in France for her perspective, responded with sympathy and helplessness. "I would be only too happy to give any aid," she wrote, "but there is absolutely no means of destroying the substance once it enters the human body. There was no cure. There was no treatment. There was only the slow work of radium in bone, the ceaseless alpha decay that would continue for centuries after the last dial painter was dead." The company, facing a public relations disaster, finally agreed to negotiate. On June 4, 1928, the case of the 5 women doomed to die came to an end. The settlement gave each plaintiff $10,000 in cash, approximately $183,000 in today's money, plus an annual annuity of $600, paid at $12 per week. All past medical and legal expenses were covered. All future medical expenses would be paid by the company. It was far less than the women had sought, far less than their suffering warranted. Raymond Berry, their attorney, recognized the unfairness. "The corporation gets a great advantage," he said, but he also understood his client's situation. They were dying. They needed money now, not years from now. They might not survive a trial that could drag on indefinitely. What Barry didn't know was that the federal judge who had volunteered to mediate the settlement, William Clark, was a stockholder in the United States Radium Corporation. The man who brokered the deal had a financial interest in limiting the company's liability. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing. The corporation never acknowledged that it had poisoned its workers, lied about the dangers, falsified scientific reports, or destroyed women's reputations by attributing their deaths to syphilis. Legally, they walked away clean, but the 5 women had won something beyond money. They had established, for the first time in American legal history, that employers could be held liable for occupational diseases. They had created precedent. They had forced a corporation to compensate workers for harm done in the course of employment, even when that harm took years to manifest. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been prevention. Justice would have been protection. Justice would have been telling 300 young women in 1917 that the paint they were licking could kill them. But it was something. And for women who knew they would not live to see old age, something mattered. Quinta MacDonald died first, 18 months after the settlement. She was 29 years old. She had spent her final years knowing what was coming, watching her body fail, wondering if her children had been contaminated by the radium she carried in her bones. Her husband had beaten her, threatened to kill her, even as she lay crippled, even as she was dying. She filed for divorce, then reconciled, then died on December the 7th, 1929, at Memorial Hospital in Manhattan. A massive sarcoma had grown on her leg. They buried her in Rosedale Cemetery, the same ground that held her sister Molly. Grace Fryer lasted 5 years. She continued working at the Newark Bank as long as she could, coming to work in her steel back brace, refusing to surrender to the disease that was crushing her spine. On October 27, 1933, the radium finally won. A sarcoma in her shoulder killed her at 34. Her death certificate read, "Radium sarcoma, industrial poisoning." Catherine Schaub died 4 months earlier, in February 1933. She was 31. She had spent her final years offering her body to science, hoping researchers might learn something that could save others. She had written a memoir about her experience, a complete manuscript that might have stood as testimony for future generations. After her death, her family burned it. Edna Hoosman survived until 1939, 11 years after the settlement. She was 37. Albina Larice outlived them all. The woman who had been bedridden in 1927, who couldn't walk, whose children had been born dead, she somehow endured until November the 17th, 1946. She was 51 years old. The last of the 5 plaintiffs, she had watched her sisters die, watched her co-workers die, watched an entire generation of radium girls pass into the graves where they would glow for centuries. The radium kept working long after the women were gone. The case of the radium girls changed American labor law. Before 1928, workers had almost no legal recourse for occupational diseases. Statutes of limitations were designed for injuries, a broken arm, a factory accident, not for poisons that accumulated silently over years before manifesting as illness. Employers could maim their workers through negligence and face no consequences, as long as the damage took long enough to appear. The dial painters' lawsuit cracked that wall. Their case established precedent for employer liability in occupational disease. It helped drive reforms to statutes of limitations, allowing workers to file claims based on when they discovered the cause of their illness rather than when the exposure occurred. The impact rippled outward. In 1941, the National Bureau of Standards established the first tolerance level for radium exposure in workers, 0.1 microcuries. In 1949, Congress passed legislation guaranteeing compensation for occupational diseases. In 1970, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was created, and officials explicitly cited the Radium Girls case as foundational to their mission. Outlast any structure humans build, any institution humans create, any memory humans preserve. The Ghost Girls' workplace is gone, but the radium remains. Rosedale Cemetery sits in Orange, New Jersey, a modest burial ground in a working-class neighborhood. Molly Maggia is buried there. So is her sister Quinta. So are other dial painters whose names never made the newspapers, women who worked the same tables and licked the same brushes and died the same slow deaths without ever filing suit or seeing settlement checks. The graves are unremarkable. Simple headstones, modest plots, the kind of final resting places that working-class families could afford in the 1920s and 1930s. Nothing marks them as unusual. Nothing warns visitors what lies beneath. But the bones underground are not ordinary bones. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. The women who painted watch dials a century ago still carry the element in their skeletons. Theoretically, their remains will emit radiation for millennia, long after the United States Radium Corporation is forgotten, long after Orange, New Jersey has changed beyond recognition, long after everyone who knew their names is dead. As author Kate Moore wrote, "The Ghost Girls will be glowing in their graves for a good while yet." Visitors in recent years have brought Geiger counters to the cemetery, hoping to detect the legendary luminescence. The readings at ground level are not elevated. 6 feet of soil provides substantial shielding. But the radium is still there, still decaying, still emitting alpha particles into the darkness. The women who were told the paint would put a glow in their cheeks got their wish. They glow still. Walk through Orange, New Jersey today, and you'll find almost nothing to mark what happened here. The factory is gone. The neighborhood has changed. The hat factories that once employed the dial painters' neighbors have closed. The working-class housing remains, but the families are different now. Generations removed from the immigrants who came here seeking work and stability and a future. There's no museum dedicated to the Radium Girls, no historic marker at the corner of High and Alden. The Superfund site has been remediated into parkland, the kind of generic green space that municipalities create when they don't know what else to do with contaminated ground. But something does remain. The legal precedents established in 1928 still protect American workers. The radiation safety standards developed from the dial painters' tragedy still govern nuclear facilities and medical equipment and industrial applications. The principle that employers bear responsibility for the health of their workers, that you cannot poison people and escape accountability simply because the damage takes years to manifest, that principle began here, in the bodies of young women who trusted what they were told and paid with their lives. In Ottawa, Illinois, another town devastated by radium dial painting, a bronze statue stands on a street corner. A young woman in 1920s dress, holding paintbrushes in one hand and a wilted tulip in the other, standing atop a clock face, the brainchild of an 8th grader named Madeline Pillar. It was dedicated in September 2011, nearly a century after the first dial painters started work. The statue captures something essential: the youth of these workers, the ordinariness of their tools, the fragility symbolized by the dying flower. The way time, the very thing they help people measure, ran out for them so cruelly fast. Grace Fryer was 34 when she died. Catherine Schaub was 31. Quinta MacDonald was 29. They were young women at the beginning of their lives, workers proud of what they did, daughters and sisters and wives and mothers. They trusted their employer. They believed what they were told. They did their jobs well, and the better they did their jobs, the faster they painted, the more brushes they licked, the more dials they finished, the sooner they died. Stand where the factory used to be on a quiet morning. before the traffic picks up, and listen. There's nothing to hear. No machinery, no voices, no factory whistle marking the start of a shift. Just the ambient noise of a New Jersey neighborhood going about its day, oblivious to the history beneath its feet. For decades, this place hummed with purpose. 300 young women sat at long tables, painting tiny numbers on watch dials, chatting with friends, dreaming of dances and futures and lives that seemed bright with possibility. The air glowed with radium dust. The workers glowed too. They called themselves the Shining Girls, and they believed they were blessed. Now there is only silence, and the question nobody answered in time. What happens when the people who profit from your labor know that labor will kill you, and they let you keep working anyway? The United States Radium Corporation never admitted wrongdoing. The executives who made the decisions to teach lip-pointing, to suppress the drinker report, to blame syphilis, to delay and delay and delay in hopes the plaintiffs would die. They faced no criminal charges. Arthur Roeder left the company and went on to lead another corporation. The shareholders collected their dividends. The lawyers billed their hours. The dial painters died young, their bones honeycombed, their jaws crumbling, their bodies glowing with the poison they had swallowed in the service of their country and their employer. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe that's what we're supposed to take from all this. The importance of workplace safety, the necessity of regulation, the danger of trusting corporations to protect their workers without oversight. But this isn't a story about lessons. It's a eulogy. Grace Fryer and Catherine Schaub and Molly Maggia and Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice and Edna Hoosman and all the others. The hundreds of women who worked those tables, the dozens who died, the ones whose names we've forgotten. They deserve to be remembered not as cautionary tales, but as people. Young women who wanted what everyone wants, work that paid well, friends to share it with, a future worth building toward. They got the work. They got the friends. The future was stolen from them by men who knew better and chose profit over truth. The factory is gone now. The women are gone. The company that killed them is dissolved into corporate genealogies that obscure more than they reveal. But the radium remains. In the soil. In the groundwater. In the bones buried at Rosedale Cemetery. And if you believe the science, if you trust the half-life of 1,600 years, the ghost girls are still glowing, somewhere beneath the surface, testimony to what happens when the people who profit from your labor value that profit more than your life. The silence is all that's left. But the silence speaks.